The last key bias, which I see underlying Western thought, the Euro-American intellectual tradition, if you would, is this idea of psychic unity. And I would say that this is actually in some ways the most pervasive of all the biases that underlie the way that folks in the Euro-American tradition view themselves and everything else around them. You see it in everything from the idea of psychiatry to things like cancel culture. All these ideas, and for example, even Facebook's idea of ranking folks in terms of likes and dislikes. So when you're looking at this, what you're actually looking at is the last of these sort of really big concepts that comes out of this idea of the West Asian religious tradition. And this is the idea of basically creation, that it's at a point in creation, God made people, he made Adam and Eve, according to the Old Testament, and then everyone else is basically the descendant of those two individuals. Now, what this means, among other things, is everyone else basically is almost exactly like everyone else. And so this is the idea of psychic unity, that everyone is basically the same. Their brains function the same, they perceive the same world around them, they view reality in the same way, they see others in the same ways. This is very much out of this West Asian religious tradition. If you think about it, this underlies, again, this idea of uniformitarianism, which basically means not only is everything the same everywhere, but also that religions are universals in the sense that every human being has the potential to be part of a religion, to become part of that religious system and belief system. And this is one reason why, among other things, you end up with huge amounts of religious intolerance and fundamentalism, is the idea that if everyone has the potential, if they don't take advantage of that potential, then there should be consequences. It's sort of one of the basic logics of a lot of fundamentalism. And so in that concept, you're talking about psychic unity. So psychic unity underlies a pervasive amount of the way that the world is viewed out of the sort of European American tradition, probably even more so maybe in the Americans. We'll get into it sometime in the future. But it's important to remember that the vast majority of the folks on planet Earth don't have that logic. They don't have that assumption. They don't have that perception of the world, and most importantly, the people around them. They don't have the idea that everyone is the same, that brains work the same. They don't have the idea that everyone perceives and functions in the same way that they do. And if you don't have this, all of a sudden, the way that you view others is radically different. And this is what you see in Asia, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, all come from non-psychic unity systems. Now, this creates a huge amount of friction when you look at things from a psychic unity versus a non-psychic unity approach. And here's a perfect example in the image here, which is just part of a small piece of the Qin Shi Huangdi's famous terracotta warrior tomb in Xi'an in Shanxi, China. Here you see these these terracotta figurines. They're averaging 5.5 to 6 feet tall. The faces are, in many cases, pretty individualistic. And there's an assumption, if you're coming from this Western tradition, that you can look at these figures, you can look at the way that they were made, you can look at how they're placed, you can look at everything about them and interpret it, because all people's brains and perceptions work the same, the basic premise of psychic unity. From a Chinese concept, that would not be the case. From a Chinese concept, even contemporary Chinese might understand the history of the period of time in which these guys were made and the burial which they were part of. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make any sort of assumption that they understand the thought processes of folks, 2,200 years ago, because they're going to assume that they were different, that they lived in different worlds, and maybe they perceived different worlds, maybe they saw different things around them. And this is really key. If you have the concept of psychic unity, you always sort of leap to an assumption when you see someone else's behavior that you should be able to understand it, because basically we're, quote, all the same. If you don't have the psychic unity assumption, then when you see someone else's behavior, you're much more liable to assume that whatever they're doing might make sense to them, but you're not going to immediately leap into the idea that you can interpret it. Now, what this also means, if you go back to this idea of universalism, is that, among other things, something like the Ten Commandments, for example, are a code of moral ethical behavior, so central to Western religious traditions, is not going to work very well if you don't have a concept of psychic unity. The idea of a pervasive moral ethical code that you can apply and basically score people on, irregardless of where they are or who they are, is demands that you have the idea of psychic unity, that everyone sees and functions in the same world. They see the same reality. Their senses work the same way. Their brain processes the stuff the same way. Because if you don't have that, then how are you going to apply a set of rules when you don't know if the other person operates in the same world that you do? So therefore, how are you going to assume the rules are the same? So psychic unity is absolutely key. And if you think about it, one of the sort of surreal aspects, since it's such a given, and especially in the American, but also European tradition, is that this means that you can use a DSM system to judge people's behavior. You basically score their behavior to basically measure how far off the norm they are. Are they too abnormal in the sense that they're outside of the norm, which is the function of the DSM test? If they're too far off of the norm, then what you can do is you can modify their behavior either through situation, through drugs, through other types of therapy to move them back in the norm. Now, the basic premise of all of this, and of course of the DSM logic and then, sort of psychological test in general, is that there is a norm. If you don't have a concept of psychic unity, then you don't have this concept of normative in the sense that you can immediately assume everyone's a part of it. And this is one reason why, if you look at society, many societies which do not have a concept of psychic unity, you find that etiquette and interactive behavior is very, very structured. Because, a certain extent, when you think about it, if you're bumping into people you don't know, as far as you're concerned, they're aliens. And this is a really important concept that I think, again, the Western world totally just misses, is in the European American concept. There's, if you go as a tourist or something to someplace like, say, China, there's an assumption that basically people are all the same. And so you can assume that if you want something, they'll understand. You can assume if they do something, you can interpret it. If you don't have that premise, then all of a sudden the world becomes a much more complicated place. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at societies like, say, in Polynesia, in China, Japan, whatever, you find that etiquette, the ways that you interact, especially with people you don't know, are really, really critical, because that almost becomes like a version of testing. You're trying to make some sense of someone you do not have any assumptions about. And you're trying to decide, do they see the world like me? Do they function the same way or similar way that I do? Can I function with them? And so psychic unity is a really sort of terrifying concept, to be honest, when you think about it, because it makes a set of assumptions which underlie just about everything in sort of Western social interaction, and it's certainly Western morality and ethics. And yet it's not a given, and there's certainly not a lot of proof for it. You can argue equally well that psychic unity doesn't exist. Many societies, people see ghosts, people interact with other things. Here in Polynesia, it's very common for people to talk to dead ancestors and to interact with what would be called animals in the Western context, but they see them either as equivalents or equals, or as superiors. And there's no problem with that, because they don't exist in a world where they assume that everyone functions and exists and senses the same world around them and interprets it. So you either live in a world of tremendous unity, which would be the Western tradition, or you live in a world of tremendous diversity, which would be almost everyone else's tradition. And this is probably one of the most important things to remember when you're interacting with others, whether it be actually going someplace different or just interacting with others, online in the digital. The digital makes it so seamless to interact with folks who aren't from your necessary, background, or even someone you're familiar with, even a place that you're familiar with, that you tend to forget that just because they can use the same digital platform doesn't mean that they're actually functioning in the same world. And this is probably one of the most important takeaways you can get from the complexity of the world we live in, that it is very complex and people are very, very different.